Thank you for joining us as the Rabies Webinar, and welcome. I'd like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Bernadette Albanese. She is a medical epidemiologist with the Tri-County Health Department in Denver. She is a pediatric infectious disease specialist who has been working in public health for over 15 years. Dr. Albanese has led communicable disease programs at state and county health departments in Colorado and New Mexico, and has extensive experience conducting rabies investigations. If any of the attendees have questions, please write them in the question box, and we will try to get them answered as quickly as possible. If not, then at the end of the presentation. So let's begin. Dr. Albanese?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar today. Let's just go ahead and get started and show you what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to go through a very brief overview of rabies disease and its epidemiologic distribution in our animal reservoirs in Colorado. Talk a little bit about the process for investigating animal bites that we have concern for rabies exposure. We'll then spend a fair amount of time talking about the new Rabies Compendium that was published on March 1st of this year and has some very substantial changes that are very important. We'll run through quick comments about human exposures, and then talk about some infection control issues and promoting pet vaccination. So nothing new to this audience. Rabies virus is a neurologic infection, a nearly fatal neurologic infection of mammals. The virus is described as species specific, and so you will read and hear about rabies strains such as bat variant or skunk variant or fox variant, raccoon variant, and those terms reflect the strains of the viruses that are sustained in their animal reservoirs. And so bat rabies, for example, spreads from bat to bat to bat to bat, and skunk from skunk to skunk, and so forth. And it's an interesting and biological dynamic between the reservoir host and the virus variant that gets impacted by the manner in which the virus is shed, and the intensity of shedding and the duration of shedding, and the interactions of those reservoir animals between each other that allows that virus to be sustained. One of the problems around rabies virus variants is that we can have spillover infections. So while transmission from bat to bat to bat to bat is fine, and in and of itself wouldn't pose risks to humans or to pets, we can get spillover infections, which means a rabid rabies reservoir can bite another mammal, say bite a domestic pet or bite a human, and transmit the virus through that exposure, and then end up with rabies infection in that as a spillover infection. What we don't tend to see, thankfully, is if we get these spillover infections, they don't tend to be sustained in that secondary host. So for example, if a cat gets bat rabies, we don't then see that virus variant then transmitted from cat to cat to cat to cat in any sustained fashion, which is good news, but it doesn't change the risk of that first episode of spillover infection, and that's what we're concerned about. So I'm going to just show you this little graphic and just briefly review how rabies moves through the body once it's been introduced. So this is a graphic showing what happens in a raccoon. So in this example, the raccoon is bitten in the hind leg by another rabid animal. The virus enters the raccoon through infected saliva. The rabies virus is neurotropic, so it wants to and migrates to the peripheral nerves, and then eventually to the spinal cord, and then eventually up to the spinal cord into the brain. And that migration is about 15 to 100 millimeters per day, depending on a lot of different conditions. But eventually that virus is going to work its way to the spinal cord, up into the brain, which is where it reaches its primary site of replication. And so as that virus is traversing, the raccoon has no signs of illness. You really have no idea that infection had been introduced, and that infection is actually moving through the nervous system and entering the brain. But however, once the virus reaches the brain and goes through sort of a massive amount of viral replication, two important things happen. One is that symptoms begin. because this virus is destructive and it's destroying brain tissue. And so when that happens, of course, symptoms will develop. But the other important part of it is that the virus rapidly spreads to the salivary gland at the time that it's replicating into the brain. And so when symptoms begin, the virus is all over the brain tissue and in the salivary gland, and at that point, the animal has become contagious. Most animals do not survive rabies infection. We certainly know that to be the case in humans and in domestic pets, and we expect that animal to die. How long animals survive is a little bit species specific and sort of is not always predictable per se in wild animals, but we do expect that at some point all animals will die. So rabies spreads by saliva. That is far and away the most important infectious material that we are concerned about. In addition, though, because this is a neurotropic virus and there is infection of neural tissue, the virus is also present in the spinal fluid, brain, and spinal cord, but those tissues are typically enclosed and encased. And so in terms of transmission from animal to animal or transmission from animal to human, the way that it typically is going to get introduced into that secondary species is through a bite from exposure to infectious saliva. On the human side of things, we are concerned about the possibility of non-bite exposures, where the virus is introduced from the saliva or from neurologic tissue, say directly into an open wound or directly onto a mucous membrane, but we really rarely see that to be an issue on the human side of things. So it always remains a theoretical concern, and we always think about it when we're doing rabies investigations, although it happens probably relatively rarely. What is important also to note that contact with an infected animal's blood, urine, or feces does not represent an exposure. These body fluids do not contain virus, and so if someone gets some blood on them from an infected animal, it is not an issue. So just to very briefly review the symptoms of rabies in animals, it's quite an extensive list, as you can see on the slide. Loss of appetite, the drooling that is often associated with rabies, all sorts of neurologic manifestations such as seizures and paralysis, unusual vocalizations. The animal may be biting at itself, unprovoked aggression, and they also may have trouble walking, be incoordinated and disoriented. And as I mentioned earlier, we expect death to occur typically within a few days. Signs of rabies in bats, which is pretty important to know, is that they can be grounded, can't fly, very erratic behavior out during the day. And that's true for any nocturnal animal that may have rabies, such as skunks and foxes, that they may be also out during the day. So let's talk a little bit about rabies epidemiology. This is a map from the CDC that shows the distribution of rabies reservoir species, so the animals that sustain rabies within their population around the country. So this is data accumulated from 2009 to 2013 from animals that test positive at CDC. And so the East Coast is all about raccoon rabies and has been that way for a long, long time. In the central part of the country, really north to south, heavy on the skunk rabies variant. That's where we really see most of that. And then we have some pockets of fox virus variant in Texas, a little bit in New Mexico, Arizona, and then Alaska. In fact, the only state in the country that has absolutely no rabies at all is Hawaii. So if you don't want to deal with rabies, then that's a real nice place to move. This map does not show the distribution of bat variant rabies because that is assumed and found all over the country. So if I would try to make a map of bats, pretty much it would blanket the entire country except for Hawaii. This next slide just shows the trends in the number of domestic animals, and on this graph that's defined as cats in red, cattle in green, and dogs in blue. The number of positive animals found in the United States over a long period of time. So in this slide, we're looking from 1958 to 2008. And if you look on the left side of the slide, you can see that big spike in the number of cases of canine rabies, quite a few cases in cattle and in cats. And that marked decline from the late 1950s into the mid to late 1960s is all attributed to pet vaccination programs. So the introduction of canine and feline rabies vaccination is the primary reason we don't have a big problem with rabies in domestic animals in this country. And the way that we're going to stay there is that pet vaccination programs are sustained and we just keep those animals up to date. Interestingly, if you look on the right side of the slide and you follow that cat trend in the red line, you can see actually of most recently, we are probably more likely to see rabies in cats than we are in dogs, and that is in part related to feral cats who are outdoors and are more likely to be exposed to a wild animal with rabies, number one, and number two, the difficulty in sustaining rabies vaccination in that population. Another map from CDC data showing the number and location of dogs and cats that were diagnosed with rabies in 2012. And I'm showing you this map because it demonstrates all of these spillover infections that I mentioned earlier. So you can see on the East Coast a lot of cats, which on this graph are shown in the yellow circle, and dogs are in the purple pyramid. A lot of spillover infection into dogs and cats on the East Coast. In the central part of the volume is quite less in terms of the number of rabid dogs and cats, and the spillover infections that we're seeing here are primarily from the skunk variant and maybe a little bit of fox variant here and there. So just to review, the primary rabies reservoir species that we are concerned about in the United States are bats, skunks, raccoons, and foxes, based on the data that I showed you from positive animals. We always remain concerned about other wild mammals being infected with rabies because of the possibility of spillover, and in Colorado in particular, we've seen that happen in coyotes and mountain lions and bobcats and other animals. Good news, though, is that we are not concerned with rabies infection in rodents and in lagomorphs. So our rabbits and prairie dogs and squirrels and so forth really considered essentially to be zero risk. I mean, every now and then public health may get a call about a really unusual situation with a rodent, but for the most part, we'll get calls about human bites from these animals, and for the most part, they are zero risk. And it could be a couple of reasons for that. One is that if one of these animals gets exposed to a wild animal that has rabies, that they may not survive the attack, and so they just simply die before infection can be established. But also some nuances that the rabies variant just doesn't take in those particular animals. Thankfully, as well, rabies still remains rare in domestic pets and in livestock, and we'd like to keep it that way. So let's talk about the emergence of skunk rabies, skunk variant rabies in Colorado. I mean, Colorado has had bat rabies for a long, long time, and that was pretty much our norm until 2007, when a coyote in eastern Colorado was diagnosed with skunk variant rabies. And since that time, we have had a gradual and persistent geographic spread of skunk variant rabies from the eastern portion of the state all the way up to I-25, and now this year for the first time crossing I-25 into Jefferson County, and we never expected that that could possibly happen. And we are definitely seeing spillover infections as a result. On this next slide, this is cumulative data on non-bat rabies positive mammals from the onset of the skunk epidemic in 2007 through 2015. The red dot represents the location of skunks diagnosed with rabies, and then we have our spillover infections. The cats are highlighted in the purple triangle, and then other mammals in the green square. And so the virus began on those eastern counties in 2007 and has pretty much marched westward I was in El Paso County a few years back, and you know, in '08 and '09, and we were having problems sort of in the south central part of the state, Larimer and Weld and Boulder sort of coming on board thereafter, and now pretty much through the Denver metropolitan area, and now this year crossing I-25, and when we update this graph for 2016, you will see rabid animals in Jefferson County and in Golden and around Westminster. So this issue is here to stay. There's really, you know, how far west it will go is going to be a lot dependent on the behaviors and movement of skunks. But this is a problem to remain in Colorado for quite some time. Just to focus a little bit on the tri-county jurisdiction, so our health department serves Adams, Arapahoe, and Douglas counties, and we have been pretty hard hit with rabies, particularly over the past couple of years. So this is just a map of the location of our rabid skunks. The red animals are what we saw between 2008 and 2014, and then the skunks highlighted in yellow is what we've had 2015 into this year, and we're sort of in the middle of our rabies seasons right now. And then in white, you can see where we've had spillover infections, and so we've had them in horses, cats, fox, and deer. So we are in the midst of this and really just expect to be dealing with this issue for a long time. So let me then run through the public health approach on assessing potential rabies exposures in domestic pets and how they get managed, and how the Rabies Compendium has impacted that. So interestingly, this fox on this slide on the left is Rabid. This is a picture taken by a teenager who found this fox running around her yard, and right after she took this photo, the fox charged her, which was a pretty big problem. So there are four main questions that we ask when we are assessing the risk of a pet being exposed to rabies. The first question is, was there sufficient contact to transmit infection? And so we're going to be looking for evidence of a bite, or a scratch, or some sort of attack between a rabid animal and a domestic pet, sort of depending on the size of the pet. If it's a large dog, for example, and that dog actually killed the rabid animal, we'd be concerned about whether that pet bit into the brain or spinal cord, for example, looking for other possible exposures to saliva, and whether or not this interaction with the wild animal was actually observed, or whether, you know, a dog or a cat just came in smelling like skunk, but no one actually observed what happened. The second question is whether the biting animal was likely to be rabid. And so what was the animal that caused the injury or got into the fight, and was it a rabies reservoir species? Was it another wild animal for which we might have concern from a spillover infection? Do we have any information about the condition of the biting animal, and whether there was obvious evidence of neurologic illness, and sort of generally what happened with the incident? The next question that we ask is to assess the pet's susceptibility to rabies, and this is all going to be about the pet's vaccination history. So if a pet has been vaccinated against rabies, the whole purpose of that vaccination is to prevent that pet from developing rabies should an exposure occur. And then the last question is the biting animal available to testing. So what happened with the contact? Was it a rabies reservoir species? What's the issue about the pet's vaccination status? And are we able to test? And so these are the four questions that we ask every time we do an assessment. We partner with our veterinarian practices, but also with animal control to sort of make decisions about managing pet exposures. The statutory authority in Colorado to do rabies investigations rests with public health, but we work closely with our animal control partners, particularly in dealing with assessing and managing pet bites to humans, and really delegate the authority of 10-day quarantines to our local animal control. And then the other high-risk exposures, when we have pets exposed to rabies reservoir species, all of that assessment is done by public health, and of course we do all the human exposures to wild animals and rabies reservoir species. But we do rely a lot on our animal control partners to help us with these assessments and institute quarantine when necessary. Just showing you this next slide to remind you on how we work with our animal control partners and when we really need for them to be contacting us for high-risk rabies exposure. So these are situations about any bites, whether that's pet or human bite, with a rabies reservoir species, because those by far are going to be the highest risk. We want to know if a biting animal at the time of the event is acting sick and may have symptoms suggestive of rabies. We want to be aware of any biting animal that dies during quarantine so we can assess the situation and make sure that we rule out rabies as the cause of the death. Again, bites by wild animals for our spillover infections, and really any time that we have to institute stricter quarantine or get involved with euthanasia. So let's now talk about the 2016 Rabies Compendium. So this is published by the National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians. We were long overdue for an update. The last update was in 2011, and so it's really been some time since this document has been changed. And it is now available. At the bottom of this slide, you will see a link to the JAVMA website and where this article is available, and also on the National Association of State Public Health Vet website. So that's how you can gain access to it if you haven't seen it already. So the biggest changes in the compendium from March of this year relate to one particular study published by Kansas State University and their veterinary school, published in JAMA in 2015. And this was an incredibly influential study in terms of outlining the rabies changes recommendations that we're going to be talking about. So in this study, they evaluated rabies titers in dogs and cats following a post-exposure booster. So these were animals who had a pre-exposure titer, then received a booster, and then got a post-titer and a post-exposure booster to see if there was a difference in titer and how those titers changed before and after the booster was given, and compared the results of vaccination between animals who came in to the exposure current on their rabies vaccination versus animals who came into the exposure out of date on rabies vaccination. And what they found was that the rise in post-booster titer, so the titer drawn after the booster was given and after the exposure was done, that the level of that titer and the change in that titer was essentially equivalent between animals who were current on their vaccination or out of date on their vaccination. And that all of the titers ended up being well above the 0.5 international units per milliliter cutoff that is considered protective in animals. The other thing is that no animals develop rabies following their exposure. So the conclusion from this study was, and the recommendations from the authors from KSU, was that animals who are out of date should be managed the same as animals that are current on their vaccination after a rabies exposure. So that was well vetted by the Rabies Compendium Committee. And after a lot of debate and sort of still some more crunching of the literature, they went ahead and made the following changes. So to begin, this slide shows the 3 categories describing pet susceptibility to rabies based on their vaccination status. A currently vaccinated animal is defined as either an animal that is a domestic pet, dog or cat or ferret, that has received 1 rabies vaccine and it's been at least 28 days, between 28 days and 12 months prior to the exposure. So these are the sort of the newly vaccinated animals. That first month has gone by, which is when we expect their immune response to begin, and they're not quite due for their first year booster. So those animals would be considered up to date and currently vaccinated. The other animals that would be considered currently vaccinated are those who have received 2 or more vaccines, and the most recent vaccine is still within the expiration date of that vaccine, sort of depending on whether that's a 1-year vaccine or a 3-year vaccine, and the animal's not yet due for their next booster. The high-risk category includes animals that either have never been vaccinated, and so they would be considered fully susceptible to rabies, or animals who had an exposure occurring less than 28 days after their first and only dose of vaccine. So these would have been these freshly vaccinated pets who haven't had that first month go by to allow them to develop their full immune response. The category that has undergone the most change is the third category, called overdue for booster. And so these include animals who have received only one vaccine, but never received their 12-month booster. And so the exposure occurs a year or more later after they received their first vaccine and they never got that booster. Or an animal is overdue for booster if they've gotten 2 or more vaccines and the most recent vaccine is not within the expiration date. So we take these 3 categories now and we move them forward into how we manage pets exposed to rabies. So if you have a dog, cat, or ferret that is classified as currently vaccinated and has an exposure to a rabid animal, that animal will, and we have valid vaccine documentation, and so that's defined by looking at rabies certificates or looking the medical records and reliable medical records within the veterinary practice. But currently vaccinated animals that are exposed are placed in a 45-day home observation and get an immediate booster that we call on day 0. So 1 booster, 45-day home observation, which means the animal can be kept at home under the owner's control. It's allowed to go out as long as it is kept on a leash or within a sort of contained area, and that animal is observed for 45 days. High-risk animals, the primary management, so for a high-risk animal, animal that's been unvaccinated, or that animal that it's been less than a month from their only vaccine, the preferred management is still euthanasia. These animals are at extremely high risk for developing rabies, and euthanasia remains the primary manner that we manage them. However, for a handful of owners who have the capacity, we sometimes will place these animals into a strict quarantine. And the change in the 2016 compendium is reducing the time from that quarantine from 6 months to 4 months. And that is based on accumulating data that looks at breakthroughs. So animals who are put, high risk, put into a quarantine, and when they break with rabies, and that by far most of these animals typically actually break within 3 months, if not within 6 weeks, but definitely most of them break within the 4-month quarantine, for that 4-month time period, such that the compendium committee felt it was appropriate to shorten that time period. In Colorado, the first 3 months of that quarantine must be done with that animal in a facility. So that is in a veterinary office, in an animal shelter, where that animal has to be completely isolated from all other animals and pretty much isolated from humans, except for very basic care, such as feeding and cleaning of the cage and things like that. But it has to be a strict 3-month quarantine, and then a quarantine at home with that animal is also not permitted to leave the home, is not allowed out, and all of this arrangement has to be approved by animal control and by public health, certainly by our agency, Tri-County, in our jurisdiction, and the owner has to be well aware of the symptoms of rabies because of the risk. Those animals are also, if they're placed into a strict 4-month quarantine, get what we call the Texas protocol in terms of a post-exposure prophylaxis regimen, which is a booster on day 0, 21, and 60. The other change of the compendium is that animals put into strict month quarantine must get their day 0 booster within 96 hours of exposure. And that time limit has never been there before, and they added it this year. And the reason for that is, again, when they looked at the animals who were placed in quarantine that broke, those animals had had a delay in their initial booster well beyond the 96-hour period, and so that was the cutoff that the compendium changed. The last category, overdue for booster, probably has the most substantive changes because of the KSU study. So if an animal is defined as overdue for booster, has a rabies exposure, and has valid vaccine documentation, so we know we have reliable documentation of what happened with that animal in terms of their vaccine history, then that animal is now placed into a 45-day home observation and given a day 0 booster, just like currently vaccinated animals. And that's a very, very big change from a public health perspective from before. The other important change is if you have an animal overdue for booster who does not have valid vaccine documentation. So the owner says, I know my pet got rabies vaccine in the past. I can't find any of my records. We now have two options. One is to treat them as high risk and unvaccinated and basically do euthanasia or strict 4-month quarantine. The other is to implement what's called prospective serologic monitoring. We're going to go over that in a second, but this is brand new. Never before have we allowed using serology to be part of the management of exposed pets. So let's review prospective serologic monitoring. So again, this would only be put in place if the right moons align. So this is an owner who reports a history of vaccination but cannot find their documentation, that they have established veterinary care, because they're going to need to work closely with you to make this happen. And so this is how prospective serologic monitoring will work. The owner needs to arrange with their veterinarian for a booster that we're going to call day 0, and we want that booster to happen within 96 hours of the exposure. However, before the booster is given, you draw a pre-booster titer. So the animal gets evaluated quickly, we do this assessment, they get into your office, and public health needs to be involved. And before you give them that booster, you draw the blood and you hold it. The owner and the pet must return within 5 to 7 days later, and that's the only window that this is permitted. So they return 5 to 7 days later and they get another titer drawn. So now we have a pre and a post booster titer. Those samples must be sent to KSU. That's the only lab that we're accepting in Colorado to do titers. And the pet owner has to be responsible for the costs, and that's something that you guys work out with your clients. And when those results come back from KSU on the pre and post titer, they get interpreted with us, with you, and the interpretation that KSU provides. And what we are looking for is presence of an anamnestic response. And so if we see an anamnestic response, meaning a sharp rise in titer between the pre and the post booster titer, that indicates that the animal indeed had been vaccinated previously. And so they ended up getting managed like an overdue pet, and they get placed in a 45-day home observation and they're done. If, however, the pre-post titers do not show an anamnestic response, that indicates that the animal has never been vaccinated before and is treated as a high-risk rabies exposure, which would be euthanasia or strict 4-month quarantine if that can be arranged. And so this is why that window has to be so short. And so when you look at what happens in the titers, when you get an anamnestic response in a previously vaccinated animal, they go up quickly in the matter of just a few days, which is why we use that cutoff of 5 to 7 days. As opposed to animals who have never been vaccinated before and get their first dose. And in those animals, the antibody titer rise is much slower. It may take 14, 21, or 28 days for that titer to go up. And so by using this very tight window for the pre-post boost testing for prospective serologic monitoring, it helps us assess whether or not animals have been exposed to rabies vaccine in the past. So this is a lot of work. This is a lot of arranging to do in a very short period of time, and it needs to be done in consultation with public health. And so we've been implementing this in Tri-County for the past couple of months. We actually have not even had the opportunity yet to test an animal, mostly because the owners somehow find their records. So when they're given the option of high-risk euthanasia versus finding their animal's rabies vaccine records, they somehow find them. But you really need to have a cooperative patient. And so, for some owners, this is just simply not going to be an option because it's complicated. So this next slide is also just a friendly and gentle reminder to you and your staff to remember to contact public health if you have a pet that comes into your practice and there's been evidence of a bite or an attack or a scratch from a rabies reservoir species or a wild carnivore because we're concerned about spillover infection. Anytime you have an animal coming in with signs and symptoms suggestive of rabies, or if an animal dies during quarantine, including if an owner has had their pet placed in quarantine because of an exposure, or because they're a biting animal and they're biting a lot of people and they just don't want that animal anymore, and they want that animal put down in the quarantine, even if it's a 10-day quarantine from a pet biting a human, and that an owner no longer wants the animal and wants it relinquished, we need to know about that because we have to make the decision about whether that animal should be tested for rabies. All right, briefly, just going to walk you through a couple of aspects of exposures of humans to animals and rabies reservoir species. We ask 3 of the same questions that we do with pets when we assess humans. First, was there sufficient contact to transmit rabies? So did the human get bit? What was the exposure to the saliva? Was the biting animal likely to be rabid? Again, is this a rabies reservoir species, another wild animal? Was the animal sick? You know, what happened? And if it's a pet bite to a human, we want to know that pet vaccination history because pets who have received rabies vaccine should have a very low likelihood of being rabid, even if they are biting. And then lastly, can we test the animal or can we place the animal in quarantine? So thankfully, dog and cat bites, even with the skunk epidemic in Colorado, dog and cat bites remain low risk for rabies transmission to humans. So we stick with our 10-day quarantine. So if a pet bites a human and they're not sick at the time of the bite, and we have no other reason to think that that animal is suffering from rabies, we will place them in a 10-day quarantine, and that's how the animal will be managed, and animal control does that, so those bites need to be referred to animal control. Also a reminder that any international bites need to be referred to Tri-County. So while we have a good, and continue to have a good experience in keeping dogs and cats pretty much rabies-free for the most part in the United States, such is not the case internationally, where canine rabies is a huge problem, particularly in developing countries. And so people who have dog bites internationally, we need to be referred to public health to assess. And then lastly, stray bites, so stray pet bites to animals, to humans, I'm sorry, are always assessed on a case-by-case basis because they may not have had the luxury to have been vaccinated against rabies. Quick reminder on how to reach us at Tri-County. So if your veterinary practice is within Adams, Arapahoe, or Douglas County, please make note, and you guys will get these slides after the talk. Please make note of how to reach us 24/7 if you have any questions about domestic pets, rabies, or anything related to that. So let's quickly begin to wrap up. And for those of you who may be involved in rabies, in decapitation, to make sure that you are implementing proper infection control in your practice. Of course, we strongly encourage that all veterinarians and their veterinary technician staff get pre-exposure rabies vaccination, and that you have appropriate personal protective equipment available in your practice, including a face mask with a shield, gloves, and we recommend wearing a waterproof apron or gown. Use a sharp knife, shears, or hacksaw. No power saw or axe. We don't want the virus aerosolized during the procedure. While a hypothetical risk, we just want to avoid that possibility. And remember to still wear your PPE while cleaning up after the procedure, and then when you remove your equipment, to wash your hands. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but these are just the instructions on packaging the specimens once the head has been removed, and to make sure that it is double bagged and sealed Ziploc bags so that there's no dripping, that they're placed in a sturdy container, whether you're working through public health, and we also make sure that this is done, but sometimes you choose to do some testing on your own, and just make sure that the specimen is properly packaged, kept cold, and properly labeled if going to the State Health Department CDPHE. And I'm just going to end our discussion before questions to just lean on you guys and lean on your practices to really encourage rabies vaccination kind of now more than ever. We're in the middle of the rabies season. We have a lot of skunk rabies going on throughout the metro area, and it's a big problem. And the best way to protect our pets, and quite honestly, the best way to protect people, is to vaccinate pets. And I'd love to, when we're done, open up the discussion and hear your thoughts on how you can or are reaching out to your clients to bring them in, to keep their pets up to date on rabies vaccination. Even consider the possibility of hosting or supporting intermittent low-cost rabies clinics. Last year, for example, in Elbert, we had a big problem with a big cat rabies investigation, and work with some of the veterinary practices, a handful of them in that county, to offer kind of limited. So what we did is a few times a month, they would carve out a few spots in their schedule to allow clients to come in for low-cost rabies vaccination. And so this was not, for every client, but each week they would open up a few slots for some discounted vaccine, and they did that periodically over the course of a couple of months. And the feedback that we got is that they actually think it went really well. It wasn't a big financial burden on them, thankfully, and they were able to get clients in that they hadn't seen in a while who were taking advantage of the temporary discount. So just food for thought to share with you guys. All right, I am going to conclude here and open it up for questions. So Tara, what have we got?
Hi, so we have a question. Where is the consideration going that boostering adolescent pets at 6 months versus 1 year is preferred?
Make sure I understand your question. So the recommendation in the compendium is that an animal, whatever age that they start, whether they're puppies or kittens or older, get their first dose of rabies vaccine, and then regardless of the type of vaccine that they got, they get a booster at 1 year. And so if your practice uses 3-year vaccines, for example, and that's all that you carry, the animal would get their first dose, and then even though it's a 3-year vaccine, to complete the primary series, they have to get their booster at 1 year. And then after that 1-year booster, you follow the vaccine manufacturers for whenever the next vaccine would be given. So if it's a 3-year booster, then it would be 3 years from then. If it's a 1-year booster, it would be 1 year. But the primary series is 1 dose, and then a dose 12 months later. So I hope that answered the question, and let me know if whoever asked that question still has some follow-up.
I haven't seen any follow-up, but I have another question. Being sprayed by a skunk is not considered an exposure, correct?
Yes, that is correct. The problem is, so that's correct, there's no rabies virus in skunk spray. Again, it has to be in the saliva neurologic tissue. The problem that we have is we'll get calls from owners, or we'll get calls from veterinarians and saying, somebody's pet was outside and they came in smelling like skunk and it was unwitnessed. And so if for some reason you're lucky enough, or the owner is lucky enough to witness the event and saying, okay, I was right there, right with my animal, I saw this whole thing happen, and there was absolutely no physical contact between the skunk and the domestic pet, and we are quite confident that happened, then we can leave that be. But that's not often the case. What we hear much more often is that they come in smelling like skunk, it was unwitnessed, and even though, we'll recommend that the animal get examined for wounds, and even though we may not see wounds, an obvious wound, we are probably going to consider that a potential exposure. If we're able to test the skunk, we will. If we're not, we're going to manage it as a probable exposure if it was unwitnessed, and even if you can't see an obvious wound, because skunk is a rabies reservoir species, and we just can't take those chances, and we have to be relatively conservative. Other questions?
I don't think there are any other questions. So I'm going to thank you for joining Dr. Albanese in CVMA Chapter 6 for this webinar. We appreciate your time. If you have any questions, you can direct them to Dr. Albanese. Her number is 720-200-1534, and I will email all the attendees her email address if you had a question. Okay, and so now we wanted to take a moment to remind you that CVMA maintains a comprehensive issues database on our website. So if you're looking for more information and resources on rabies, visit www.colovma.org. From the home page, okay, here we go. From the home page, you just click Issues under Issues and Advocacy. And before you can access our issues database, you do need to sign in first. If you have never signed in before, your username should still be set to the default, which is your first and last name with no spaces. For example, John Smith. The username is not case sensitive. The default password is all lowercase, and it's CVMA1234. If you have logged in before and changed your username or password but forgot it, you can click on the link below and sign in button that says click here to reset your password. You can enter either your username or your email that's on file with us, and you'll receive a link to reset your information. You can also give us a call, and we're happy to reset it for you. The CVMA main number is 303-318-0447. Once you're logged in, you'll be redirected to the issues database. You'll see that we have information on a large variety of issues, from drug compounding to sales and use tax to marijuana and pets. Go to the R section and you will find our rabies resource page. The link to the compendium and the Q&A about interpretation are listed here along with other helpful links. There we go. Great, and so thank you all for joining us. We will be sending out a short survey shortly after this webinar, and we would appreciate if you took a few moments to fill it out. Thank you again for attending, and a recording of this webinar will be available to all CVMA members on the CVMA website under Meetings and Educations and Online CE. Thanks again. Hope you all have a good day. Bye.